The Claiming of Grimmauld Place by bixgirl1. Chapter 3, Part 2. With Curious Promise.
"Stop sending me bloody Patronuses!"
Ron's voice, exacerbated and ghostly, issued from his silvery terrier, completely discordant from the way it gave a silent friendly bark and wagged its tail, bouncing excitedly around Harry. Harry frowned and reissued his stag. He looked at him, majestic and patient, one hoof slightly raised.
"Tell Ron I have to,"
he said to it, then, knowing it would infuriate him, added,
"Malfoy said so."
The stag bowed its head, looking down almost curiously at Ron's terrier as it dissipated. Harry's Patronus cantered away and disappeared. He sat down on the couch and waited, grinning.
"It's just funny,"
he confided in Frank, who was making the long trek over to him from 2 feet away. He summoned a small pot of Malfoy's flowers from a stasis jar on the mantel and opened it. He raised his eyebrows. There were now 3 different colors of flowers, as well as something that looked like a cactus. Harry carefully picked the red ones out to feed Frank until he asked Malfoy about the new additions. Frank looked up at him with understanding.
"Thank you for not getting irritated when Frank shits on the floor,"
Harry murmured to the house. He still felt more than a little silly, but he'd not been locked out of the loo in well over a week, and the light had stayed on in every room he was in, so there was that. Plus, he found the more he paid the house these little compliments, the more he was actually able to believe them.
"It's no wood of my wand,"
Blaise remarked.
"It's your floor."
Harry looked up to see Blaise standing in the archway of the parlor.
"I was just... Did you knock?"
Blaise opened his mouth to respond, but Ron's terrier came back and said,
"I'm busy, and I will legitimately unfriend you if you stop telling me of how it gets you off to let Malfoy order you around, mate. I'm not kidding. There are some things I don't need to know."
Mortified, Harry looked at Blaise, who raised his eyebrows and smirked as he walked into the room.
"That's not what I told him."
"I am definitely not one to judge what you and Draco get off on," Blaise said blandly. He sat down on the sofa and draped one leg over the other. Face burning, Harry refused to look at him, instead choosing to stare down at Frank, who seemed fascinated with Ron's Patronus as it gave him a lick and disappeared. Harry fed Frank another flower.
"I don't get off on that,"
Harry said. It was probably true. He'd never tried it before. He finally glanced back up. Blaise flashed his teeth in a grin.
"Oh, you expect me to believe that Draco doesn't either?"
Blaise asked. He twitched his wand in the direction of Harry's kitchen and summoned a bottle of beer.
"Help yourself,"
Harry murmured.
"Thanks, I will."
Blaise twisted off the cap cleanly and tilted the bottle up.
"Want one?" "I don't know what Malfoy gets off on,"
Harry said, ignoring the offer of his own beer as well as the sting that accompanied the truth of his statement.
"Oh, I know,"
Blaise said, a wicked gleam in his eye.
"What does that mean?"
Harry twisted and pinned Blaise with a look.
"What are you even doing here?"
"We were supposed to go out, Draco and me, I mean," Blaise said. "He's not here, I'm assuming?"
"When is he ever?"
Harry asked sardonically, though it wasn't entirely fair. In the last 2 weeks, Malfoy had breakfasted with him every morning and had given him small tips of instruction on how to deal with the house. Do not apologize to creature for asking for something. Assume that what he needs will be where he needs it, but mention aloud that he is seeking whatever it is. Touch something in the house with affectionate reverence on a regular basis, and that bit of instruction, issued in Malfoy's posh tones, had sent Harry's imagination into overdrive. Keep casting more complicated magic within the walls. Invite people over, etc., etc. It was complicated enough in itself. But worse than that, the snogging hadn't stopped. In fact, it had only increased in both frequency and fervor. They didn't talk about it much, but for Harry's fumbling attempts now and again to find out if they were possibly dating or just headed in the direction of shagging. The last time they had kissed, Malfoy had pressed Harry into the doorframe, rolling his body against Harry's for nearly a full minute, his cock pressing insistently against Harry's hip before he'd pulled away, pink and panting. Harry wanted to know. He did. But it was also bafflingly nice to have something happen to him like this, slow and exploratory, without definitions, when Harry least expected it. Except for the last few days when Malfoy had started darting out every morning directly after breakfast and not coming home until Harry was in bed. Not even to work on his potions. Harry tried to tell himself Malfoy wasn't out having wild sex with someone who wasn't him. Not that they had decided on anything in one way or another, or had made any sort of commitment, but couldn't quite convince himself. It made it difficult to think of anything else, even when having a bloody meeting with McGonagall, who thankfully required robes even for teaching fellows, which hit a lot.
He has a lot to do,
Blaise agrees.
Yeah, but what is it?
Harry sighed and cast his Patronus again, telling it to ask Ron what he was so busy with at 9 in the evening. He considered using his cloak to follow Malfoy more than once, only to falter when he remembered 6th year.
Business?
Blaise said, spreading his hands wide.
He takes care of his family businesses.
Harry's eyes narrowed.
Fine, don't tell me. Poor Potter. Is Draco ignoring you?
Blaise said, clucking his tongue. He scooted closer deliberately, arm resting over the back of the sofa. Harry felt Blaise's forearm brush against his hair.
Are you finding yourself in need of some company?
And bloody hell, Blaise smelled good. He also had a fair point. Harry had taken to wanking twice a day since that first kiss with Malfoy, pulling himself off in his morning shower and before going to sleep with rough, increasingly frantic jerks. It probably had largely to do with the fact that he'd not had sex since well before Malfoy had moved in. Unfortunately, he didn't want Blaise. Not the same way he'd come to want Malfoy.
Are you offering?
He asked slowly. Blaise stilled, looking caught.
Potter?
It's Harry, he said smoothly, leaning closer. While Malfoy and his friends still felt as though they could unnerve him was beyond Harry. But it was fun to fuck with them back. They never seemed to expect it.
Right, yes.
Blaise's dark eyes darted away.
But Draco?
Draco, what? Harry said. Put a hand on Blaise's thigh. It rippled under his palm, tensing.
He isn't here, as you pointed out. Yes, he is,
Malfoy said from the edge of the room. He sounded exhausted, but his expression was thunderous.
Go away,
Harry told him, smirking.
Blaise was just offering up his arse to me.
Malfoy's expression eased. He walked over to his side chair and began to sit a few inches to catch him as he fell into it.
Blaise offers his arse up to everyone,
Malfoy said. He sighed. His robes were uncharacteristically rumpled.
I don't offer my arse,
Blaise said, resuming his former position. The glare he directed at Harry was respectful, at least.
Why not?
Malfoy said, yawning.
It's rather nice, as I remember.
Harry frowned and caught himself.
You two, not like you two,
Blaise put in.
Or not.
Harry yelped automatically. He sought Malfoy's eyes. A muscle in his jaw jumped, but he didn't look away. Ron's terrier came back.
With Hermione?
It informed him in increasingly clipped tones, "about to do what you've been wanting to do with Malfoy. So just go do it and leave me the fuck alone, or I swear to Merlin, Harry."
Harry stood, almost tripping over Frank in his haste. Malfoy sat up, the wariness gone from his face, while Blaise began to snicker.
"You should have heard his last one,"
Blaise said.
"Ron knows nothing," Harry said. "Ron knows more than he tells us," Blaise said slyly. "I don't tell him anything."
Harry stressed, face burning at the lie.
"He was just joking."
Malfoy sat back again, expression blank.
"That Weasley is the only one having regular sex right now is appalling,"
was all he said. Then,
"Francis needs to go outside."
Harry swallowed. Heart rattling hard, he tried to take advantage of the out Malfoy had given him and focus on anything else.
"Frank needs to go outside,"
he said in a quiet voice he'd been reserving for the house. The French doors gusted open. Malfoy came to his feet. "Thank you," came the soft whisper in Harry's mind as they all stared startled out at the patio. Frank started inching towards it.
"Did you hear that?"
Harry turned to Malfoy, who was staring at him with a wide smile on his face.
"Yes, well done, Potter. You'll have the elf heads down in no time,"
he said. He somehow managed to make it sound both sarcastic and genuine with praise, and something deep in Harry's chest exploded with pride at Malfoy's validation, at the approval in his eyes. Unthinkingly, Harry caught him up, pressing an exuberant kiss to Malfoy's startled mouth. Malfoy's hands came up to rest on Harry's hips, and even as Malfoy kissed him back, Harry couldn't be sure if Malfoy was going to push him away. Blushing hotly, he pulled back before Malfoy could.
"Jesus,"
yet Blaise muttered, shifting where he sat. Harry refused to look over. It hadn't occurred to him that whatever his arrangement with Malfoy might need to remain private.
"You had it?"
Harry asked again, cocking his hand to the side. He released his grip on Malfoy, took a deep, unsteady breath. Belatedly, he murmured,
"Yes, thank you too." "You're welcome,"
Malfoy said, blinking. His eyes had gone heavy-lidded, and he took a shaky step away.
"Heard what?"
Blaise asked.
"You told the house something, and it did what it was supposed to do." "The house talked to me,"
Harry said, looking at Malfoy. One of Malfoy's pale brows lifted.
"Again?" "Again? Oh, damn it."
Harry took in Frank's paws and the puddle spreading beneath them. Harry vanished the mess, then levitated Frank the rest of the way outdoors before he went any further. He slanted a glance at Malfoy.
"We're fortunate he's so magical, or he might do that every day." "You have a gnome,"
Malfoy reminded him, lip curling with distaste. Blaise coughed a laugh.
Who is riding my tortoise?"
He suddenly shouted with astonished fury. His eyes were murderous. He turned to Harry.
"Take care of it, or I will."
Harry glanced over to see that Paul had indeed climbed onto Frank's shell. It also looped a thin ribbon around his throat. His legs were splayed wide over Frank's shell as though it were a saddle.
Harry shuddered. That wasn't a pleasing sight,
and he was chortling as he tried to coax Frank along by kicking a heel against him. Without a backward glance, Harry strode out to the garden.
"What the fuck, Paul?"
"Just making use of creature,"
Paul said snidely, doing a crude approximation of a horseback riding that made him look like he was humping Frank.
ugly creature."
"He's not ugly,"
Harry growled, leaning down to pluck him up. Paul dodged to the side, putting up a dirty foot to kick out at Harry, and yipped at Frank to go faster. Frank blinked with customary indifference.
"What has gotten into you?"
Paul glared at him. He released the ribbon around Frank's throat, then hopped up to stand on the back of his shell.
beans.
he demanded. I'm not giving you candy for acting like this.
Give me beans, Draco.
He held out his filthy hands expectantly. I put out beans for you yesterday, like every night. They were gone this morning, so I know you ate them, Harry said warningly. You're not getting any tonight. Eat the worms. Paul suddenly leapt off Frank with startling agility and bounced, catching himself on the front of Harry's t-shirt. He climbed, raggedy nails digging into Harry's clothes, until they were face to face.
Yellow hair, fuck you. You give me beans.
Jesus! Harry gasped out, prying Paul away from his body. No, you're not getting them because you were rude to Frank. Be nice and you can have them tomorrow, he added, trying very hard not to think of walking back into the house and dragging Malfoy to bed. Sneering at him, Paul shook his head.
Yellow hair, don't frog. You smell of.
He sprouted a series of noises that had no connection to any language Harry was aware of, but the crass, jerking motion Paul made with his right hand spelled things out well enough. Harry tossed him gently, and Paul's ugly little face twisted.
You know it too.
He nodded.
Outside, Draco.
Then he bounded away, disappearing hurriedly into the ground as though afraid Harry would come marching after him. Harry was half tempted to, both to demand an apology for Frank and an explanation for what Malfoy was or wasn't doing outside. Harry crouched down, scratching lightly over the top of Frank's head. Hey, sorry about that. He has no manners. Frank opened his mouth in what looked like a yawn as Harry pet him. A chilly spring breeze ruffled past them, smelling somehow of both damp earth and wet concrete, and carried with it the sounds of voices from the house. Harry got up and walked closer to the door, sticking to the shadows, and wishing he had set of extendable ears for the way the conversation drifted in and out. What were thinking? Malfoy demanded. Blaise laughed. You said you two weren't yet. It's none of your fucking business. Anyway, Malfoy spat out. What if said yes? The sound of a snort. The way he kissed, don't think much of a problem, Blaise said. I was just trying to things along. Well, Malfoy said, sounding sullen. It's not as if there's anything really even. It doesn't. Really even what? Harry wondered frantically. He didn't what? But Malfoy and Blaise's voices were drifting off into indecipherable murmurs, and Harry turned back to Frank. He likes me, he announced, shoulders sagging when Frank looked back at him with a dubious expression. Harry sighed. Yeah, I know. Ready to go inside? Harry levitated him carefully through the door, setting him down in his preferred spot near the fire to rest from his exercise. The front door closed, and Malfoy entered the room a moment later. You're not going out with Blaise? Harry asked. Too tired tonight, Malfoy said. From doing what? Malfoy took a step forward. He methodically unbuttoned his robes at the throat with one hand, working down the line of them until they were hanging open. He was wearing dark grey trousers and matching waistcoat underneath. And as soon as his robes were open, he reached up to tuck his pale grey tie loose, his eyes on Harry the whole time. You kissed me. So? Harry reluctantly drew his eyes up from the buttons being popped open at Malfoy's waistcoat, perfectly tailored to hug his slender torso. He felt defensive and vaguely off balance. Malfoy's eyes steady on his face. With a jolt of shock, it occurred to him that he hadn't yet. He'd been too confused by their changing dynamic to question it or even allow himself to pursue it. All of the kissing that had been done, though eagerly reciprocated by him, had been initiated by Malfoy.
Harry dragged in a breath and walked closer. He knocked Malfoy's hand away from his waistcoat and slipped the last button of its buttonhole with his finger and thumb.
"What are we doing?"
Harry asked. Malfoy cracked a low, wild laugh.
"I'm still not convinced this isn't the longest, most frustrating wet dream I've ever had,"
he said. He curled a hand around the back of Harry's neck. His palm was warm and dry. Harry shook his head, determined not to let Malfoy take control this time. He fisted a hand in the fabric of Malfoy's dress shirt and tugged him forward, tilting his chin up slightly to catch Malfoy's mouth with his own. Malfoy's hand applied pressure, angling Harry's head more, and then his tongue was licking hot into Harry's mouth, his other hand tight on Harry's waist. Harry shivered, walking him backwards to the armchair Malfoy usually sat in, then urging him silently down, rumbling an approving sound when Malfoy obeyed. His body was taut beneath Harry's hand, chest rising and falling shallowly under the shirt Harry had caught in his grip, but he was also pliant, easing into the chair as Harry continued to kiss him as though well practiced at not losing contact. Harry sucked at Malfoy's lips, nipped at them gently, propping himself on one knee between Malfoy's loosened thighs. Jerked slightly when the hand cupping his neck slid down, fingers dancing lightly to tuck up his shirt and coming to a rest, fanned out over the warm skin at the small of his back. One finger dipped into the back of his jeans, and a moan broke free from Harry's throat. He pulled away. Malfoy's lips were spit-sticked and pink.
"I want you,"
Harry said, stomach fluttering at the admission. His cock was hard. It ached. Just in case he wasn't clear, he added,
"I want to take you to bed, Malfoy. I need to go to sleep,"
Malfoy said, voice low. But he reached up and kissed Harry again, pulling him down on top of him. The angle wasn't comfortable, perched with one knee on the chair between Malfoy's legs, so Harry adjusted, sliding against him more fully and then, when Malfoy didn't object, straddling him. It brought their cocks into contact, and Harry grinned against Malfoy's mouth when he shuddered.
"But what, hypothetically,"
Malfoy asked breathlessly, breaking away for a moment,
"what we do there?"
Harry muffled a groan as images assaulted him. Malfoy spread beneath him, pale and panting and covered in a sheen of sweat. Malfoy hovering above him, huffing hot puffs of air against Harry's neck. Harry buried his head against Malfoy's throat, tips moving in a slow grind that made him gasp. Harry bit his lip, pausing, then resumed. He licked at the cords of Malfoy's throat.
"We could do whatever you like." "I like a lot of things, Potter,"
Malfoy said on a rush of air. Both of his hands reached around Harry's hips to cup his ass, long fingers biting into it as he guided Harry over him. He rutted upwards against Harry.
"I can do a lot of things. Jesus, I'm going to come if you keep doing that,"
Harry choked out, caught the shell of Malfoy's ears between his teeth and sucked on it. Malfoy's hand stilled, moving away from his arse to clamp over his hip bones and hold Harry. Harry closed his eyes.
"I'm going to kill you,"
he muttered.
"You were right. We're never going to get out of this here alive."
Mouth drawing down, Malfoy blinked at him. He looked uncertain and strangely vulnerable, and Harry sighed. He planted a hand on the back of the chair and heaved himself up and away, then rubbed a hand over his face, wishing it was Malfoy's hand, and that his face was his own cock.
"Fuck. Are you a virgin?"
Harry finally asked softly. He didn't think it was like it, but Malfoy's odd skittishness made it seem as possible as anything.
"Is that it?"
"No." Malfoy said. It sounded like he was striving for an even tone, but Harry took savage satisfaction from the fact that Malfoy's trousers were obscenely tinted from the fact that his voice was hoarse. Just... He shook his head. I want to. Harry backed away even further. He sat down gingerly on the coffee table and looked at Malfoy for a long moment, then inhaled deeply. His heart felt as if it were begging to be released, pounding as it was.
Then why? I don't know, Potter,
Malfoy said, standing suddenly. He curled a hand through his hair and paced half the length of the room and back before turning and facing Harry again. More quietly, he repeated, I don't know.
Because I'd be upset if I found out this whole thing was you taking the piss with me,
Harry said, voice mild, though he watched Malfoy warily for his reaction.
I want you to,
Malfoy said. Harry's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded encouragingly. But Malfoy just shook his head, looking as frustrated as Harry felt.
Is it that we live together? Merlin, no.
Malfoy's laugh was semi-unhinged, which, for some reason Harry didn't want to examine, was incredibly comforting.
I just can't. Yet.
He said again, and that one word shot a lance of heat straight to Harry's groin. He placed his palm against it with a stifled groan. When he looked back up, Malfoy's eyes were zeroed in on it. He had stubble burn around his mouth, on his neck, and Harry wanted to...
Okay.
Malfoy looked equal parts disbelieving and insulted. Harry gave a pained chuckle.
I'm not seeing anyone else, are ye?
No. Malfoy swallowed.
But I'll not be here for long. It's not in my plans.
Harry took a deep breath, not liking the sound of that. He'd never liked the sound of it, really, though he hadn't realized that when Malfoy had first indicated his staying at Grimmauld was more transitory than permanent. But especially in the weeks that they'd been getting closer, Harry had felt it was leading up to something. He had assumed it had meant the same thing to both of them.
It doesn't have to mean anything,
Harry said after a long silence. Malfoy's eyes narrowed. His lips pursed as he studied Harry, and Harry fought to keep the heat from rising in his face. He'd never been the best of liars. He cleared his throat and searched for a way to let Malfoy draw the conclusion he wanted.
Or it could. For as long as you're here, I mean.
He added, trying to make it sound as simple as he could, when his whole body wanted to weep. After another moment, Malfoy gave a curt, non-committal nod, and Harry let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Somehow he'd fallen into dating Malfoy. Had even offered himself up to it, though Malfoy hadn't made any promises and was determined to make clear that it couldn't last. Harry fancied him. The realization was astonishing and a little appalling. Malfoy still grated on Harry's last nerve half the time, but Harry was surprisingly okay with it.
If you want to wait until... whatever, Harry said, I just mean I can wait.
Suddenly the lamps lowered, flickering near out. The fireplace crackled with heat blazing bright, and shadows danced over the sharp angles of Malfoy's face in the darkness. 2 war sconces holding candles lit up, and the room took a decidedly seductive feel. Harry blinked.
I'm not sure about the house, though.
Malfoy took a halting step towards him, his hand fisted at his side.
This fucking house, he muttered.
He walked closer and leaned down just as Harry lifted his chin.
Don't talk to my house that way,
he said, smiling, just before Malfoy kissed him again. The kiss went on and on, tongues and lips and teeth. The taste of mint soft and faded on Malfoy's tongue as it plundered Harry's mouth. Harry's hands tightened on his thighs to keep from yanking Malfoy back down, to keep from undoing his thighs with frantic fingers. When Malfoy finally broke out of the kiss, his eyes were dark with confusion.
"Fucking hell, Potter,"
he said under his breath. Pressed a softer, lingering kiss to Harry's swollen tips, then straightened away. With a final look, he turned and walked from the room, shoulders stiff. Harry watched him go. Go after her. Harry swallowed. He shook his head.
"Not until... No."
He looked into the fireplace.
"But thank you."
He waited until he heard Malfoy's door shut at the top of the stairs, then headed up. The water in the shower was perfect, hot but not scalding, and Harry shuddered as he stepped under the spray, allowing it to soak him and bleed the tension from his muscles. He grabbed the soap from the shelf and lathered his hands, then closed his eyes and leaned his back against the warm tile as his hand found his cock, beaded at the tip with precum. He began stroking himself, thinking of Malfoy's long fingers, of the elegant arch of his spine, and the goddamn cool taste of mint as they kissed. His balls drew up and he cupped them, hissing, pulling on his cock without haste, wanting to draw it out. He wanted it to feel the way it might when Malfoy finally relented, when things stopped being so confusing between them. He fucked slowly into his fist for a long minute, exploring his body the way he hadn't bothered to lately, touching himself in the places he liked with gentle fingers, stroking over his arsehole, then moving up to tweak his nipples. His mind stayed on Malfoy, on his strange sense of loyalty and his surprisingly bawdy laugh, and even that look of furious vulnerability on his face after Harry kissed him, on all of the things that had always made him so fascinating, and it was this almost bleak thought that caused Harry to groan, working his hands fast over the shaft of his prick as it pulsed out his orgasm. Ron had been right about why he'd picked Malfoy. God fucking damn it. Tired, Harry pried himself up from the wall. He finished showering, then stepped out of the shower. The towel beneath his feet was warm, and Harry looked down in surprise, then began to towel himself off briskly. He wrapped the towel around his hips and headed back into his bedroom. He stared. The floor was dingy and dark and scratched these last few years, no matter how many cleaning charms he cast at them or how many of Molly's homemade solutions he applied, were suddenly like new. They shined with a high polish, the dark oak gleaming in the low light of his room. He took a tentative step into it, then another when the floor didn't vanish beneath his feet. "Creature?" he whispered. Creature appeared with a small pop.
Yes, sir. Does you need tea?
Harry shook his head.
My floor, did you do that?"
Looking down at the hardwood, Creature thoughtfully curled his floppy ears around his finger.
No, Creature is not being able to get the floors to shine.
He admitted in his low, creaky voice.
Creature is wanting to iron his hands for not being able to tend to the house like a proper elf, but it is not letting me.
"Then how?"
Creature perked up.
"The house is being doing it, sir."
He sounded positively gleeful for someone over, Harry assumed, 1,000 years old. Creature's eyes brightened, and some of his many, many years seemed to melt away from his face.
"My house is being pleased with you." "This is because I kissed Draco?"
Harry asked. He didn't like that one bit for some reason.
"This is because you are being a good and distinguished wizard who's treating his house like a good and kind house. The house is wanting to give you things, is wanting to be yours, and—"
Creature broke off, eyes going shifty.
"Creature will be happy to be able to clean again."
Relieved, Harry gave him a nod. "I can help," he said, eyeing the rich, saturated colour in the wood, the way the grain stood out now that he could see it. The rest of his room looked painfully dull by comparison. His old bat bought cheaply from a Muggle furniture store when he and Ginny had moved in together. His tatty wardrobe in the corner with its years-old flaking paint that he'd gotten from a consignment store just because he'd needed one. The faded purple wallpaper decorated in grey gargoyles. The floors played against everything else in high contrast, and Harry felt a surge of possessive pride for what he knew it could look like someday, if the house allowed it.
"Thanks, creature,"
Harry said at last.
"No, I won't be needing tea tonight."
Creature nodded, tugging his tea towel, and made to leave. Impulsively, Harry said,
"Wait."
Creature looked at him curiously. Harry padded over to his wardrobe and pulled out a soft black pair of joggers, slipping them on under his towel before removing it. He went to the bed and sat down, putting his glasses back on, then sighed.
"Does Malfoy? Do you know where he goes every day?"
"No, Master Harry."
Creature sat, blinking up at him. The lines around his mouth sagged heavily.
"Do you know what he does in the basement?"
Brightening, Creature nodded.
"He eats Creature's food I brings him, and mixes potions."
"Does he?"
Harry swallowed.
"Does he ever have anyone here when I'm gone?"
"Mistress Pansy,"
Creature said.
"She's enjoying Master Harry's room very much."
Not expecting that, Harry looked at him.
"What?"
"She is looking through your room and saying that someone as boring as Master is not going to be hurting Master Draco,"
Creature offered, elaborating.
"because you doesn't have any whips and chains or fun things, and that you is not likely to murder her after all."
Harry snorted, taking that in. "Next time, tell her that I keep my whips and chains and fun things in the attic," he said, making a mental note to fill a box with the most filthy sex toys he could find, along with possibly a list of ways to murder someone and get away with it. He bit his lip, wanting to probe more. Creature always knew what was going on inside Grimmauld Place, at the very least, and Harry was vaguely ashamed of not having thought of asking him before. But guilt was seeping in, blanketing over his curiosity about all of the things Malfoy refused to discuss.
"Thanks, creature."
"One thing was as being important for a wizard,"
Creature said, sounding oddly tentative. Harry looked at him sharply, but Creature lowered his head to avoid his eyes.
"But important things is more important."
Harry pursed his lips. He thought to ask what he meant, but the way Creature studiously didn't look up at him indicated he wouldn't get a straight answer anyways.
"I'll ask Malfoy what that means, okay?"
"Master Malfoy can answer many questions, but Grimmauld Place is not answering to Master Malfoy,"
Creature said cryptically.
"Grimmauld Place is seeking, wanting Master Harry. Master Malfoy is only—"
Creature stopped, sealing his lips closed. Harry narrowed his eyes.
"All right,"
he said slowly. They'd long gotten past the point of wailing or grumbling furiously, while Creature punished himself for not obeying Harry's indicating wishes in full. But Harry knew the urge still dwelled in Creature, so he left that bewildering statement alone too.
"I'm going to bed now."
Creature nodded again and disapparated, and Harry crawled into the bed. Down the hall he could hear the faint sounds of Malfoy shuffling around in his room. Harry closed his eyes. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this part of The Claiming of Grimmauld Place by bixgirl1. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.